Hello, and welcome to our lecture for Anatomy and Physiology, IOM 1120. Today we'll be discussing anatomical references, cell membrane, membrane potential, synapse, and action potential. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start off today with anatomical references. Whenever we talk about anatomical references, we first have to know the three planes of the body. And there are multiple names for the planes, and then they also have their corresponding definition. So we need to know the name and the corresponding definition. Whenever we look at this teal line, which is going to separate the body into left and right, that is our sagittal plane. Our sagittal plane is also known as the median plane, and as you can see, it divides the body into left and right. So imagine just splitting your body straight down the middle. That is the sagittal plane. If we look at this light blue plane right here, this is the plane that divides the body into front and back, or anterior and posterior. So imagine if you're standing upright and you divide your body into front and back, or anterior and posterior. That is the coronal plane, also known as the frontal plane. And then the last plane that we have has several names, and it is the one that looks like a circle. So imagine if we slice the body here, we're going to divide the body into superior, which is above, and inferior, which is below. This is called the transverse plane or the axial plane, also known as the horizontal plane. So it has three different names, and this is the plane that separates the body into superior and inferior. So you can be asked multiple questions. You might be asked, what plane divides the body into anterior and posterior? And you would need to be able to answer with coronal or frontal plane. In a different perspective, you could be asked, what is another name for the transverse plane? So you would need to know transverse is also axial or horizontal. Another way the question can be asked is the sagittal plane divides the body into blank. And at that point, you would need to know that the sagittal plane divides the body into left and right. So these are different ways that you could be asked about the planes of the body. This is really the basis of anatomical references. If you think about a CAT scan, what is a CAT scan? It's computed axial tomography. Axial meaning that the slices that you see are slicing the body this way, in this plane, which is dividing your superior from inferior. Okay, when you think about the sagittal plane, you may have heard the term parasagittal. There's a parasagittal plane for EEG electrodes. Para just means off from the center, so parasagittal is the plane of electrodes that run down the middle of the body, but offset a little bit. That's your parasagittal plane. So we use the planes of the body in several different ways, and I think this is imperative for everyone to know. So now that we've gone over it, let's test our knowledge. So if we focus on this box here, okay, and if I said this plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. It is this light blue box here. What plane of the body is that? That's going to be our coronal plane. That is correct. And then what is another name for coronal plane? coronal plane is also known as the frontal plane. And I like to remember that because the coronal plane separates the body into front and back. So frontal plane goes with coronal plane. All right, if we look at our teal box here, so if I tell you that this is the sagittal plane, and then my question is, what does the sagittal, or how does the sagittal plane divide the body? So right here, how does the sagittal plane divide the body? The sagittal plane divides the body into left and right. And what is another name for sagittal plane? Another name for sagittal plane is the median plane. And again, I like to remember that because we are splitting the body down the middle. So the median plane is also known as the sagittal plane. And last but not least, the plane that is depicted by this circle here. What plane is this? And how does it divide the body? So this is the transverse plane, also known as the axial plane, also known as the horizontal plane, and it divides the body into superior and inferior. So hopefully you feel very comfortable with the planes of the body. If there's any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me. So we're going to move on to some other anatomical references. The first one I would like us to know is afferent and efferent. Afferent, the definition is that it conducts towards a structure. Okay, we often associate the word afferent with our sensory root. This is incoming information. So if you look at the picture here, we have the skin and the spinal cord, and the afferent nerve is sending information toward a structure, and in this diagram, it is toward the spinal cord. So afferent is associated with sensory. Conversely, we have efferent. Efferent is going to conduct away from a structure. This is outgoing information, and we correlate efferent with our motor root. So again, if we refer to our diagram, we have our spinal cord, which is our structure, and we have the efferent nerve going out to the muscle. So this is our motor nerve that is sending information away from the spinal cord. So afferent sensory, efferent motor. Afferent is toward the structure. Efferent is away from the structure. So to test our knowledge, the anterior root is blank since it conducts impulses away from the spinal cord, and away is your key word. Is that afferent or efferent? And then the posterior root of the spinal nerve is blank since it conducts impulses toward the spinal cord. And your key word here is toward. Is that afferent or efferent? So our first one, away from the spinal cord, that's going to be efferent. And toward the spinal cord, that is going to be afferent. All right, our next anatomical reference terms are proximal and distal. And it's important that we understand that these terms are used when referring to the upper and lower extremities. So we would never use the word proximal and distal if we're talking about the trunk. Okay, this is specifically referring to the extremities, meaning the upper extremity and the lower extremity. So when we use the word proximal, we're talking about something that is closer to the trunk of the body. And when we use the word distal, this is something that is farther away from the trunk. So I like to think of the trunk as my reference point, and then imagine your arms are going out, because that's just easier to think. Your arms are out in a T, and then your legs, of course, are straight down. So anything closer into the trunk is going to be proximal. Anything farther away is going to be distal. Now, the tricky thing about the term proximal and distal is that structures can be both distal and proximal. It's going to depend on your reference point, because you have to have a reference point. And we'll look at this in our examples. So, if we think about the wrist and the elbow, remember your arms are out in a T. Your wrist is blank compared to your elbow, proximal or distal. But your wrist, so it is your wrist, is blank to your fingers, proximal or distal. So your wrist is distal to your elbow, right? Your arm is out, your elbow is closer to your trunk than your wrist is. So your wrist is distal to your elbow, but your wrist is proximal to your fingers. Again, your arm's out in a T. Your wrist is closer in than your fingers are. Therefore, your wrist is proximal compared to your fingers. If we think about our lower extremity, our knee compared to our hip. So we're standing straight up. We're thinking which is closer, which is farther away from our trunk. Our knee is blank to our hip. Is it proximal or distal? But our knee is what to our ankle? Proximal or distal? So again, we're standing up. Our knee it's farther away from the hip, right? Compared to the trunk, the knee is farther away than the hip. Therefore, the knee is distal, okay? But the knee is proximal to the ankle. The knee is closer to the trunk than the ankle is, so the knee is proximal to the ankle. So this shows you how one structure, the knee, it can be proximal or distal depending on the reference point. When we compare it to the hip, it's distal. It's farther away from the trunk. But when we compare the knee to the ankle, it's proximal because the knee is closer than the ankle. Okay, our next anatomical reference is going to be medial and lateral. So this is why it's important for us to know the planes of the body. These terms are based on the sagittal plane. And remember, the sagittal plane goes directly down the middle of the body. The sagittal plane separates the body into what and what? It separates the body into left and right. And what is another name for the sagittal plane? The sagittal plane is also known as the median plane. Okay? So, medial and lateral are terms that refer to the position of a structure relative to the sagittal plane, which is represented by this blue line here. Anatomical structures A and B, so trying to think generally. If A is closer to the sagittal plane compared to B, So let's say I draw an A right here, close to the sagittal plane, and then I draw a B out here. If A is closer to the sagittal plane compared to B, then it is medial. And B, so remember I drew a B right here compared to A being right here. So B is lateral compared to A. A is medial compared to B. So again, it's, am I closer to the sagittal plane? Then I'm medial. Am I farther away from the sagittal plane? Then I'm lateral. So, our example. Imagine you have the sagittal plane drawn down the middle of your body. We're talking about your eye and your ear. Your eye is blank to your ear. Is it closer to the sagittal plane or is it farther away? Is it medial or lateral? And your ear is blank to your eye. So is your ear closer to the sagittal plane or farther away from the sagittal plane? Is it medial or lateral? So filling in the blanks, the eye is medial to the ear and the ear is lateral to the eye. All right, next anatomical references, ipsilateral and contralateral. So ipsi is our prefix, contra is our prefix. You can see both of these words have lateral on the end of them. So ipsi meaning the same side, contra meaning the opposite side. So ipsilateral meaning on the same side of the body, contralateral meaning on the opposite side of the body. If we think about our motor function, if the right motor cortex controls the left, upper, and lower limb movement, then the motor cortex controls the blank side of the body, ipsilateral or contralateral. And I like to give this wordy sentence because it's important to not get lost in some of the questions that you may see on the CNM exam or on your exams in the course. It's important to be able to look at a question and just pull out the information you need. So what do you need out of this sentence? Really, you only need two words, right and left. The right motor cortex controls the left, upper, and lower limb. So is that the same side, ipsilateral, or is that the opposite side, contralateral? And I hope that we know that our right and our left are the opposite. So the right motor cortex controls the left, upper, and lower limb. Then the motor cortex controls the contralateral side of the body. All right, our next terms are rostral and caudal. A lot of people refer these terms to the head and the tail. So if you think of that for a human, it's your head and then your trunk. So your torso. Head to tail, think about your head pretty much going all the way to your butt, okay? So if structure A is closer to your head compared to structure B, then you would say A is rostral to B. If structure A is closer to your head than structure B, you would say B is caudal to A. So rostral is going to be closer to the head, caudal is going to be closer to the tail. If you think about your lungs and your diaphragm, so here's your head, this would be rostral, and it curves and it goes down towards your bottom, and that's going to be caudal. So your lungs are blank to your diaphragm. Are they closer to the head or are they closer to the tail? And the diaphragm is blank to the lungs. So is the diaphragm closer to the tail, caudal, or is it closer to the head, rostral? So the lung is rostral to the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is caudal to the lung. So rostral and caudal. All right, next we have superior and inferior. Hopefully everyone's familiar with these terms. Essentially, when we talk about superior and inferior, there is some overlap with rostral and caudal, as well as distal and proximal, and we'll bring all these terms together and talk about the differences here in a second. But we have our lovely patient here, and she is standing in anatomical position, meaning she's upright, her palms are facing forward. Essentially, what plane of the body divides the body into superior, up, and inferior, down? What plane of the body divides the body into superior and inferior? That is going to be the axial plane. Here, we have superior and inferior. Another name for the axial plane is the horizontal plane, and another name is the transverse plane. So remember, axial, transverse, horizontal plane, all of those divide the body into superior, which means above, and inferior, which means below. So, as a human is standing, blank means above and blank means below. I just gave these away. Superior is above, inferior is below. Good job. All right, next we have anterior and posterior, which I believe most people are also familiar with. I do want to point out that anterior is synonymous with ventral and posterior is synonymous with dorsal. So they mean the same thing, okay? Most of the time we use ventral and dorsal in veterinary medicine, and we use anterior and posterior with human anatomy. So that's the primary difference, but you might hear them used interchangeably. So, again, going back to the planes of the body, because that's the basis of our anatomical references, if we draw a line down our patient this way, it's going to separate him into anterior and posterior. What plane of the body divides our patient into anterior and posterior? This is starts with a C. That's your hint, starts with a C. The coronal plane, and another name for the coronal plane is the frontal plane. So remember, it divides into front and back. The frontal plane, also known as the coronal plane, divides the body into anterior and posterior, or ventral and dorsal. So, as a human is standing, blank refers to the anterior part of the body and blank refers to the posterior part of the body. We have ventral or dorsal. So ventral refers to the anterior part of the body and dorsal refers to the posterior part of the body. Okay, so we've talked about several anatomical references, and I think where a lot of people get confused is how do we differentiate these? It's easy when we're going over these pairs, but when we have all these words together, how do we know which word is appropriate to use when? So my question to you is, how do we differentiate rostral from caudal, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior, distal, proximal? How do we differentiate these? Well, I think there's one that we can easily separate from the others. And that's because it's exclusively used for the extremities. So what set of words is exclusively used for the extremities? This one, proximal and distal. We're only going to use proximal and distal when we talk about the upper extremity or the lower extremity. That's what makes proximal and distal unique. Now, when we talk about the three other pairings, we do need to look at a picture of the brain. So we talked about rostral and caudal, rostral being towards the head, caudal being towards the tail. So you'll see this plane of the body is unique in that it is a curved plane to describe rostral and caudal. Now that is different than anterior and posterior. So imagine that I draw a line through the skull this way. Here is anterior, here is posterior. So rostral and anterior do overlap, but posterior is different than caudal. Okay, so I want to make sure everyone feels comfortable with that. Anterior, posterior is this way, okay? And that is different than rostral and caudal, which is this way, okay? If we go up and down, this is superior and inferior. So now we have overlap in inferior and caudal, but superior, meaning above, is independent of rostral, anterior, posterior, caudal, inferior. Superior is its own thing. So that's how superior and inferior are different. And the last, I believe those were the three. So we have rostral and caudal. Remember, that's the curved line. Anterior and posterior go straight across. Superior and inferior go up and down. And some of these do overlap, but some of them are independent of the others. Again, if you have any questions relating when we take all these terms together, feel free to reach out to me. All right, a few more anatomical references, superficial and deep. So superficial means towards the surface, deep means into the body. So really when we use these terms, you have to think of a three-dimension object. We're talking about we're on the outside versus on the inside. So think about a bean bag, okay? The covering of the bean bag is superficial. The beans inside of the bag are deep. They're deep within. So that is the difference between superficial and deep. Now when we relate this to the human body, I have this diagram here of the skin. So we have several layers of skin. The epidermis is the most outer layer of skin. Then you have the dermis that is underneath the epidermis. So when we talk about the epidermis and the dermis, okay, the epidermis is blank to the dermis. Is it more superficial or is it deep? And conversely, the dermis is blank to the epidermis. So the dermis is blank to the epidermis. So we have the epidermis is superficial to the dermis, and the dermis is deep to the epidermis. Flexion and extension, these are very important when we think about doing our preoperative evaluation to check our patient's motor ability. We would want them to flex and extend. So what does that mean? I like to think of flexion and extension in the terms of degrees. So if you imagine that with the arm, this is 180 degrees, right? It's a straight line. Now if you bend at the elbow, I guess let's go here. So 180 degrees is a straight line. If you bend at the elbow, now this is 90 degrees, right? So if the degrees decrease in number, we went from 180 to 90, that is flexion. That is flexion, okay? If the degrees increase, so we are going from 90 to 180, that is extension. So again, straight up, we're at 180, we decrease that angle, we are flexing. We increase the angle, say we're going from 180 to 200 degrees now, here. That's extension, hyperextension. So you can flex and extend your head. We normally flex and extend for craniotomies, anterior cervical fusions. We run pre-positioning baselines to try to ensure that the flexion and extension of the head is adequate so it's not compressing the spine. We do the same with the arms and the legs with positioning, flexing and extending at the wrist. We can also have lateral flexion at the torso. So this is a common anatomical reference that we need to know, very applicable to what we do every day as well as patient positioning. Another is abduction and adduction. I always like to say abduction, A-B-D, duction, and adduction, A-D-D, duction. Okay? When you think about adduction, A-D-D, I think of it as the arms are coming into the body. The legs are coming into the body. I am adding to the body to be one whole. So that's how I remember it. Adduction, ADD, I am adding to the body. So my arms and my legs are coming in towards the torso. That's different than ABD. Again, I think my B and my D are different, right? They're different letters. So my arms are going away, my legs are going away. I'm going away from the midline because my B and my D are different. They want to be separated versus when I'm adding to the body, I'm coming in. So that's just a fun way that I remember it. A B deduction is going away. A D deduction is going towards. So those are all of the anatomical references that we're going to go over today. I do want us to test our knowledge now that we have all of these in an application manner. So if we look at this first diagram here, this is our planes of the body. So if we look at this plane here, this first blue box, this plane is separating the body into superior and inferior. What plane of the body is this? And what is another name for that plane of the body? It has 3 names. Can you name all 3 names? The transverse plane, the axial plane, and the horizontal plane. And those planes separate the body into what and what? So the axial plane separates the body into superior and inferior. Okay? Now let's look at this box right here. That's going to be this plane right here. What plane of the body is that? And what does it separate the body into? So we're going right here. That is the sagittal plane, also known as the median plane. It separates the body into left and right. And last but not least, we have this blue box, which is separating the body let's say, going this way. I'm sorry, this is our sagittal plane here. So now we're talking about this box that's going this way. That's going to be the coronal plane or the frontal plane. It's going to separate the body into anterior and posterior, or front and back. All right, when we look at our second diagram, we have the light blue boxes. What would this light blue box be? And then its word pairing would go here. And then our yellow boxes, what term would go here versus here? So we have superior, inferior, anterior, posterior. Good job. All right, a little repeat. This blue box here represents this black line going down the middle of the body. What plane of the body is this? The sagittal plane, also known as the median plane. And you can see the parasagittal or paramedian is just offset from the sagittal plane there. All right, now for a more tricky one. So we have the two purple boxes. It's pointing to the shoulder and the finger. That's going to be a word pairing. So the shoulder versus the finger, how would we describe those? So first we're talking about an extremity. So what word pairing is specific to the extremities? And then the shoulder is closer to the trunk. The fingers are farther away. So the shoulder is proximal and the fingers are distal. So this is going to be different than our two green boxes here. When you look at the green boxes, they're the same distance from the trunk. So we wouldn't use proximal and distal for the green boxes because one's not farther away than the other, like the purple boxes are. So what terms would we use if we're at the elbow and we want to describe the outside of the elbow versus the inside of the elbow? What anatomical references would we use? So the outside of the elbow versus the inside, we're referring to how far from the sagittal plane are we? So if we're farther from the sagittal plane, we are lateral. If we're closer to the sagittal plane, we are medial. So this is lateral and medial. All right, that is going to wrap up the anatomical reference portion of the lecture. Now would be a time to take a break if you prefer.